Welcome to Design for Learning, a podcast from Notre Dame Learning. I'm your host, Jim Lang. Today, I'm looking forward to a conversation with Michelle Miller, who has authored a new book on learning and remembering student names. Students are returning to your campus this month if they haven't returned already, and so the struggle begins anew in terms of this perennial challenge. If you've ever said that you're the kind of person who is terrible at remembering names, or you want to understand why learning names is so hard, or you just want to get better at learning student names, this episode is for you. Dr. Michelle Miller is a cognitive psychologist, researcher, and speaker focused on supporting and inspiring teachers, instructional designers, and leaders who care about learning. She advocates for building learning experiences based on research on how people learn, and for using educational technologies in ways that align with those principles of learning. She's the author of several books, most recently, A Teacher's Guide to Learning and Student Names, Why You Should, Why It's Hard, How You Can, which was just published by just a couple of months ago by the University of Oklahoma Press. She's also authored Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology, and also Remembering and Forgetting in the Age of Technology. Michelle completed her PhD in cognitive psychology and behavioral neuroscience at the University of California, Los Angeles, and currently serves as a professor of psychological sciences and President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University. Welcome, Michelle.
Hey, it's great to be here.
So I'm looking forward to our conversation today, and we're going to talk about student names and all the challenges of learning student names. One thing I've learned from 2.5 decades of teaching is that the struggle to learning students' names is a very widely shared one. So I hear people say this all the time. I'm just not very good at learning student names, as if there's some unique deficiency they have. But it turns out learning and remembering student names is difficult for most people. So why is that?
Well, I'll affirm too. I hear that a lot as a cognitive psychologist, and cognitive psychology is still a little bit of a obscure discipline. But when people hear that I study memory and learning and things like that, that's something that almost inevitably comes up. Just exactly how you're describing it, like, oh, I have this secret problem. What is going on? And so it really is a very common issue. And within cognitive psychology, and there's even a subfield of psycholinguistics, which is that's actually where I started out, is this interdisciplinary kind of territory between linguistics and psychology, social psychology, and especially cognitive psychology. So within this area, uh, we actually have made a tremendous amount of progress in understanding exactly why that common experience happens. So this is not always the case in my discipline, but back in the 80s and early 90s, so quite some time ago, and right when I was kind of coming into my own and considering going into this field, we kind of got a grip on this problem. And so within our discipline, it's a success story of like, yeah, we understand this, but it's a little dire in terms of what we learned as far as the inherent difficulty of the problem. So people who, for example, read the best-selling book Moonwalking with Einstein, you've heard of this one before. It's something called the Baker-Baker paradox. And this was
Right.
like the big landmark discovery and that allowed us to start, first of all, documenting that yeah, this isn't just a subjective impression. This actually is, I mean, names are harder to remember than other information about a person. And I get into all the ins and outs of it in the book, but basically it was this very clever paradigm where they tried introducing people to these, artificial profiles that show them a picture and say, oh, this is Mary Baker and she's a Potter. And you'd have to remember that. And of course, you could swap it around and say, this is Mary Potter and she's a baker. And just when you just take that same identical word, Baker with a big B, Baker with a lowercase b, um, that transforms its memorability. And so, of course, there's a few, little squabbles around the edges about exactly why, but we all agree that essentially when you turn a word into a name, that makes it kind of this arbitrary token in a way. So instead of being part of a very rich network of knowledge, like saying, oh, somebody is a professional potter, what does that mean? It becomes this piece of information that's sort of hanging out there all by itself. And there's very few ways to retrace back to it if it's weakened or you first forget some aspect of it. So that is something that is absolutely very, very common.
So
Um,
let me
yeah,
interrupt here and just sort of
sure.
clarify this. So if I someone tells me they're a potter, I meet that person at a party, then I go home
Mhm.
later. I think, oh, person was a potter because I know stuff about pottery. Like maybe I've tried pottery myself, or that my wife is a potter, or like I saw a movie about pottery, right? So
Mhm.
because of that, I remember that person because that name is connected with, or that profession is connected with all these other things I know about that area as a person, as opposed to a name, which say that a completely random name, there's no network around it.
Exactly. No network around it. And again, while our understanding of, well, we'll call it semantic memory, like rich interconnected knowledge, our understanding of that has evolved somewhat in the last couple of decades, but I think there's broad consensus that many of us in the field of memory and memory research do think of knowledge in that way as a rich, sometimes very messy and unpredictable, but interconnected network. And that means that there's some redundancies in the system as well, right? So if you associated meeting this person who's Mary Baker at a party, if you kind of associate it with the documentary you saw, or asking about what sorts of pieces that they make, and even being able to visualize every time we have a sensory, experience that's associated in there too, that also becomes part of it. If any little piece of that falls apart, you can sort of retrace your steps back. So you can think, what I wish, oh, that's right. She reminded me of that film that I saw. And then voila, we remember what she does for a living. And there just aren't that many built-in kind of mechanisms or advantages that we can leverage when it comes to a name, other than some very, very basic information or associations we might have about, say, being named Baker. um, there's just not a lot to go on. And it sort of creates a single point of failure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so these are isolated pieces of information which are not connected to anything. As a result, and also we know a lot of people, so we have like multiple isolated pieces of information, right? So that
Hmm.
why names are really a challenge for us, right? So given that, okay, and every semester you have a new batch of names to remember,
Right.
and of course, for a long teaching career, you're gonna have thousands of names you'll encounter and have to remember. I mean, but we don't remember all of them. So given that, like, you know, is why is this important to do? Like, and also, like, should I expect to learn student names? Like, if I say to you, I'm a terrible person at remembering names, you're going to say to me, that's okay, it's hard. Or should you say, no, you can actually can get better at it, or there's some strategies that you could do. So, what should my expectations be, and why is it important?
Yeah, and this is a great question. I mean, the setup that, yeah, this is an extremely common issue. It's much more the exception than the rule. To say, oh, I don't struggle with this. We can give ourselves grace for that, and have some kind of common experience here, but absolutely, I think that having it be a part of our teaching practice is still quite important, right? So as some folks have talked about, this is really foundational to having an inclusive classroom, and one where students feel really welcome, and even getting the finer points, like making sure you get the pronunciation right every single time from the beginning. All those can make a very big difference. And I relate in the book too, the flip side. What if we don't do this? My very first semester as a teaching assistant back at UCLA, picture enormous state school. And so these breakout sessions were essentially like miniature classrooms with 30 or 35 students apiece. What did I do? I totally focused on, I'm going to make a really slick presentation, and the students are going to watch and be incredibly impressed. And I worked so hard. And what did my comments at the end of the semester say? They said, she didn't try to learn our names. And I was like, oh my gosh. Well,
Ouch.
all that, yeah, all that preparation, all like, oh, look at me, look at my expertise. That it really goes by the ways if the students don't feel welcome. So yeah, there's that kind of like okay, if you do this, this is a wonderful advantage you can have from day one and really start to distinguish yourself in your classroom as being really inclusive and dynamic. Or you can be like me in my first semester teaching. So the choice is yours. So I think that that is something that we do need to expect of ourselves. And I think, I mean, we can, get into some specific ideas, but it really does start, as with so many things, with making a plan. And that was a big turning point for me when I really kind of turned pro and got into my own full-time teaching position was, all right, whether you're going to have a way of studying names in advance, whether it's going to be an icebreaker, or some other methodology, what is going to be what's going to be your strategy that you're going to walk in there in the first week and get yourself off to a great start.
So we have a shared interest in attention and engagement in the classroom, right? This is another issue I think we can think about in relationship to learning names. The student who's aware that I know their name is maybe more willing to engage in the classroom, like a discussion or something like that, if I call them by name and they know that I recognize them as a person and I value their opinion as a human, not just as like one other voice is saying something in the room to push the discussion forward, right? So like they want to feel value in those kinds of engagement exercises as well. And I think there's also I think good research on the fact that names have the power to draw our attention, right? And so I think all these things give us more reasons to really think about the value of doing this practice.
Right. That's it's an amazing connection to make. I mean, this is a brief book, and I didn't kind of get into that aspect of, but absolutely, you're touching on something that has been, oh my gosh, we've got 60, 70 years of research tradition within cognitive psychology that do come down to names, whether it's auditory or even in vision. It really jumps out at you more so than almost any other kind of stimulus that you can have. And so, yeah, we've had lots and lots of clever ways to demonstrate that names are incredibly privileged. So right, what could be more attention grabbing in a good way,
Yeah.
but also really personally affirming. And yeah, I mean, I hope that this book and this conversation we're having, it does inspire more people to, as a matter of course, know lots of student names early in the semester. It may not be the case right now. So again, you're kind of it's also something that students notice and they say, "Oh my gosh, I can't, she actually addressed me, even though this was a big class, or I know she has four different courses and so on."
Yeah, it's a little bit sad, but sometimes, in smaller classes, like I taught for many years in, smaller seminars, and students will often say, "You're the only professor who knows my name." It was kind of sad, right? So me be able to say, make a commitment. If we can all make more of a commitment to it, we're never going to get there. Everyone be knowing everyone's names in large classes and all that kind of stuff. But making commitment to it, I think, is really important. So let's talk about that. So let's say I'm, someone who feels challenged by this, and I want to get a little bit better. What can I do to improve my ability to learn and remember student names?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the basic technique, I have a sort of a, doesn't trip off the tongue, but it'll do acronym that came up with: attend, say, associate, retrieve. And this, there, in no way is this specific to a classroom setting. So this is one that one probably can and probably should start to practice in sort of everyday life. There's nothing inherently different about it being student name. So attend, say, associate, retrieve, I think is, if not totally self-explanatory, a good trigger to what we should start to do as an absolute habit. And it does, as you mentioned, attention. We know from that shared interest that all meaningful learning pretty much starts with attention, and it is a learning task. Whether I'm standing around at the new faculty mixer at the beginning of the semester or meeting that class, the first thing is, oh, here's a name. And it may seem very, very simple. However, usually on that first day of class or in other social situations, our attention is going 20 other places, right? We're seeing if people have finished filing in. What am I going to do next on the PowerPoints? What's this flashing light on my laptop doing? But if we can retrain ourselves to say, okay, a name just happened. I need to be attentive to that. that's a big part of the battle. And then, of course, the say, also so deceptively simple, but there's also kind of some complicated reasons why, but you actually have to pronounce either out loud or in your head, either way, to practice kind of what we call the output phonology. So how a name sounds is one thing, how you actually say it is another. And so that helps solidify it. And it also is really a good little catch in case, oh my gosh, this guy's name just went out of my mind. There's still sort of that open window to say, oh, I'm sorry, did I get that?
Yeah,
Not that that ever
absolutely.
happens to anybody else, but
Yeah.
associate is a little bit, I put parentheses around that when it's sort of the optional stage. We hear about the little name mnemonics of making association, and those can be a little problematic and not always easy to come up with on the fly. But especially if you're really trying to learn quite a few in a short period of time, let's say, okay, they remind me of somebody else I know with that same first name, if there's something about them. Proceed with caution, but maybe. And then, of course, retrieve. And you and I also have a shared interest in
Yep.
the most powerful applied deliberate memory strategy known to humankind at this point, which is retrieval. So let yourself almost forget the name. Whether that takes a few seconds or a few minutes or a few weeks is up to you. But every time you then say the name, that's is a form of retrieval practice. So it was really, really nice to meet you, Micah, and I can't wait to continue the conversation at next class period, that kind of thing. So the more you can drop those in, the better. And you're already, as you mentioned, the student is maybe going to notice, oh wow, they're already using my name. So following that practice. So with that sort of core, there's lots of other ways to play this out. Of
Wait,
course,
let me,
studying in
sorry,
advance,
can I interrupt
lots
one
of
more
other
time?
things.
Yeah, let me interrupt one other time. Because I think there's something that's built into the way that we teach, which
Hmm.
helps give us the opportunity for that retrieval practice. In other words, every time you leave the classroom, you're going to come back, there'll be 24 hours or 48 hours later, you're going to see that student again. And that means that we can not give up on the first week. That, if we try to practice the names each time we see the student for the first time or the next time, right, we have an
Hmm.
opportunity to have forgotten a little bit and retrieve it in the next class period. So it's actually it works in our favor to a certain extent, right? That over time, essentially we're spacing out retrieval because of the classes spaced out.
Yeah, I mean that's and I like that as a positive angle in the situation that we find ourselves in, as opposed to say the classic cocktail party. Am I going to see this person again? Or oh my gosh, here's that vice president I only see once a semester. Yeah, so make that work to our favor and to our advantage as well. And it's absolutely spaced and distributed practice. And I mean, I don't think that there's any hard and fast limits around how long is it acceptable to still be struggling with names, but
Yeah,
I would go with at least the first 2 or 3 weeks
I like
of
it.
class.
That's
Yeah.
that's good grace right there.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, you were about to start giving some more
Oh,
strategies. Yeah.
oh, sure, sure. So other strategies, icebreakers, if you're doing them, can also or meet and greet activities can be a vehicle for this as well. I have a kind of an elaborate one that I describe in the book, but I mean, think about it. If you have, say, a small group discussion activity on the first day, and maybe even tapping into some of your classic now suggestions about how to use that first day of class really well, have students working on a problem or learning about each other, something like that. Well, they're in groups, and I can circulate, and each little group becomes this
Mm.
little manageable pod to, again, do retrieval practice and distribute that practice. Oh, I'm going to walk up to this group in the corner and your name, your name, your name. I'm going to say them. How nice to meet you. And if I can make it to most or all of those small groups, great. And if students hear that, maybe I'm modeling, or maybe I want to deliberately tell them this is the time for you to also know each other's names. I'm also not going to expect them to memorize everybody in the room on the first day, but hey, imagine just the power of knowing, okay, person to my left and person to my right. I actually know their first names. How? Because I was kind of nudged in that direction by the instructor on the first day.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the first day a little bit here because it's such a lot of stuff is happening that first day. Like, again, for like a smaller class, you might have students introduce themselves. But I could make a point, for example, to say, I can repeat the name back. The say part is then maybe I often in the past maybe have left that out. They introduce themselves and they move to the next person, right? But I, the instructor, could say, make a point to say, repeat the name back when I respond to them, and also being transparent about that. And to say, I'm going to say, you introduce yourself, and but every time I'm going to say something, I'm going to say your name back because that's a way for me to help remember names. And it's an important value for me to know your names. There's a little practice. It might be seeming a little annoying today, but again, that gives me an opportunity to do that. The other thing I'm thinking now, and based on what you're saying, is that like the small groups, maybe we do an introductory activity where they introduce themselves, but then in their small groups, I can go around and have a second time to affirm that, that first introduction. So those first day, that first week, every time I'm talking to them, I'm trying to say their name and again try to build up those associations as we meet. It's kind of interesting, that say piece is. I'm sure you've been in these conversations too with people who will. I meet someone for the first time and they'll say my name like 10 times in the first few minutes of the conversation. Yeah. And I always thought, geez, what are you doing? But apparently there is there's reasoning behind this, right? Apparently.
Yeah, there is reasoning. Now, covert rehearsal, as we would technically call it
Yeah.
in cognitive psychology, that also should be fine.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, let's normalize it. And I agree with you. I think I changed my perspective on that conversational approach after I really started thinking it through. Yeah, there's probably some social limits around it, but
Right.
at least once or twice you should try.
I assume that people had read some business book, which about helping them to
Hmm.
network or something like that. When I
Hmm.
heard that kind of happening to me as the other
Yeah.
person who was being whose name was being learned. A couple other follow-ups here in terms of large classes. So again, and so I'm more familiar with the smaller classes. But let's say it's someone who says my class is 100 students. I'll never learn all those names, or even 300. So what should my expectation be for myself, and what can I do in that situation?
Hmm. Right. And I absolutely agree. And this is something really important as we talk to our fellow faculty. If it's something that works in your little seminar, uh, and you're presenting it to somebody who teaches, intro to chemistry, and it's 300, 400 people. I mean, they'll quite rightfully they'll check out if it doesn't apply. So here too, now there is no kind of arbitrary limit. Like the brain can only learn so many names at a time. As I share in the book, my personal limit is around, if I've got 30 people in a room, I can probably, since I have all these tricks down, I can get those folks. When you get over 50 or 60 or so, then you're talking about essentially sampling some of them. Now, some of my practices that I try to follow as a general heuristic in larger classes is, in those big classes, you probably do have those students who stop by at the beginning or at the end of class. They've got questions, and I tend to assume that that's also the student wants to make a connection. Now, if you're that student who's usually stopping by to continue the conversation or let me know what you did earlier today, then I will know your name. Um, I think beyond that, keeping in mind that we're going to know a subset of names, not all the names. I do, it's good common sense to say, well, at least distribute that equitably. Memorizing the first two rows is probably not just the way to go. And, monitor yourself and say, why are there certain demographics or students that I already know or I gravitate towards and I've got their names. But as long as you have some, that there's some research that shows wonderful research that shows that students kind of overestimate in a positive way how many names we know if we know at least a few. And then is a practical point, most folks who are veterans of that type of teaching situation, the table tent. So get yourself down to your local craft store, get some heavyweight cardstock, and have students write in big visible letters their first name and then actually use it in class. That was a great point, Jacob. And after that, we're going to go to Rosa over here in the corner and normalizes the names, gives you a little bit of practice. And as you use them, students will also get that idea of like, oh, yeah, she's using the table tent, so I'm going to actually hang on to mine. And I also like to offer stickers and markers and things. We're all nervous on the first day, and we can kind of do a craft project. So that can also help students personalize them as well. So those are some tricks of the trade for the big classes.
So actually, I co-taught a course this summer with Christy Redenga, the director of CANEP Center at Notre Dame, and she used the name, name tense, essentially in a very small seminar class. And this I had not done this in for myself in the past. And she would have the students, she would have the name tense. She would actually hand them out, and so the students would have to. She would actually go around and use them as a way to say hello to the students every day. In other words, so here you, and especially in the first week, she would say their name, give them the name tent, and then they would put them up so they could see each other's names as well. So there was a lot of value going on there in ways I didn't realize at first. When I thought, well, it's 2 weeks in, there's like 12 students here. We know each other's names, but it was really good. It was a good thing for me to see that this showed the value of someone's name, not only for Christy and I, but also for them to see the value of each other's names. And so I think name tents can be used in multiple contexts and for very good reasons. And even especially by the first week or two, it was very valuable to walk around and hand them out because you could definitely feel those moments like, oh, I should know this student's name, but I don't. And I would just say, remind me. Can you remind me? But eventually, you get them all, right? I mean, especially in like a smaller seminar.
Yeah. I mean, I'm all about efficiency. When there are things that we're doing pedagogically anyway, the classic classroom assessment techniques, and we can also use them as the time for retrieval practice, and actually using that output phonology, so much the better. And it occurs to me too, in a way, I think teachers today, we may have lost one of those natural opportunities when we started doing work online, which I'm a huge fan of. Don't give me pieces of paper, but didn't we used to do that a lot, right? And they were walking around the
Right.
classroom, and okay, where's Jacob? That's right. And
Right.
people may not have even realized what that was doing for them. And now that's all happening offline. Maybe we don't even have pictures in that LMS that we're using, and so we're losing that. But yeah, it can work the other way too. At the end of class, I'm frequently taking up index cards. I'm a huge fan of, the exit question or this and
Yeah.
that. And they've got their name on it, and
Right.
maybe not for everybody, but at least in that, mayhem of the last 5 minutes of class, a few of those are coming in. I can look, I can say, I can retrieve for at least a few folks.
Yeah. Actually, I think there's a practice I benefit from in terms of student names, like throughout most of my teaching career, because students would write these short writing exercises at the start of class, and I was always walk around and hand them out student by student, which would force me to like where they are sitting, and that helped me that association, which actually makes me wonder about virtual environments. Now, of course, the names are always on the screen typically,
Yeah.
but the flattening of context in a virtual environment in terms of like associations between like a physical body sitting in a room and where they actually sit is kind of flattened in a virtual environment, right? So I mean, but maybe it's not so important because the names are on the screen. I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and this is one of the few areas where somebody who kind of thinks a lot about online versus face to face. I go, "Yep, this is different. The whole idea is different." But still, just getting in that habit, I know for me to actually use the name, I think more of us too are trying to entice students, even if they're in an asynchronous class, to try to set up some kind of a phone call or a Zoom call with me at some point. And there I
Hmm.
can continue to use my good and hopefully well ingrained habits of actually using the name. But right, what you're describing in that face-to-face classroom where we like it or not, we make associations. How does a student usually dress, and definitely where they sit? That's your brain kind of shoots from the hip when it comes to encoding memories. It's not always like super systematic. And yeah, if that student always sits in the corner and wears a backwards baseball cap, that visual and that spatial information, our brains are very attuned to picking that stuff up. And of course, if we get too dependent on that, the student gets a haircut, forgets their hat, and just decides to sit with their new best friend on the other side of the room, and then we're totally lost. So that's another reason to make sure that we've already reinforced as much as we can a nice, strong memory.
That's great. This is all really fascinating stuff. And if a reader wants to, or a listener wants to learn more from you, they can go to the book first of all. But where else can they learn from you, or contact you, or get more information about you and your work?
Well, great. I mean, most of the time these days, LinkedIn is my social media of choice, and I also have a Substack that's free, that folks can sign up for if they'd like a semi-regular set of newsletters that really focus on learning sciences, and applying those to teaching and learning, especially in higher education contexts.
And you give talks and workshops on this material as well?
Oh, as much as I can. I absolutely love working with faculty groups and also leadership groups around these issues. So yeah, you can. There's lots of different ways to engage with this content, and yeah, definitely reach out to me, get a hold of me on LinkedIn, or check out that Substack.
All right. And by the way, I can't recommend that Substack highly enough. It's great
You.
sort of summary encapsulations of new research in learning and in psychology and cognition. It's just really fascinating stuff, always with practical applications. So absolutely recommend it to listeners. Okay, thanks, Michelle. It's been a great conversation as always, and I'm looking forward to chatting again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you as well.
Designed for Learning is a production of Notre Dame Learning at the University of Notre Dame. For more, visit our website at learning.nd.edu.